Well, howdy. My name is Lew Bolton, and I'm here to give you a little sneak preview about one of the events that will be happening during Wilderness Wildlife Week in January 2022. I will be talking about Wiley Oakley. That's this fellow right here. Wiley Oakley was a very famous man in the Smoky Mountains back in the early 1900s to about mid-1950s, I guess you'd say. And Wiley was known as the Roamin Man of the mountains. Has anybody out there actually heard tell of Wiley Oakley? Anybody? Oh, I see somebody out there that is. Somebody over there, good, nodding their head. Well, good, I'm glad you've heard about Wiley. And I can't see you, but I bet you're just like me, you're old. Because it seems like most of the young people these days have never heard tell of Wiley Oakley. But after this program, I hope you'll learn a little bit more and appreciate the man. He was quite a character in his day. Very well known, probably one of the most memorable, colorful fellas who ever walked the trails in the Smoky Mountains. Well, Wiley Oakley, Wiley Manson Oakley was his full name. He was born at the foot of Mount LeConte, as he liked to say. And this was a long time ago in September 12th, 1895. Long time ago. And he was born, he said, a stork flew in, threw him through a window onto a bed, and forgot all about his clothes. So he was born, and something happened to him when he was about 8 years old. His mother, Elmina Connor Oakley, she died, and his daddy, Henry Coleman Oakley, he started taking Wiley into the wilds, into the woods to do some hunting, to do some exploring. And from that time on, Wiley was a man who roamed these Smoky Mountains. Calling him the Roamin Man of the mountains was absolutely on. It was right on point because he loved to roam these mountains. He loved to explore. He loved to discover things and learn things. And even though he was born at the foot of Mount LeConte, he said it took him 8 years to get to the top. But during that time, Wiley grew up in these mountains and loved them and loved being there better than anywhere else. But there came a time when he was a teenager when things started to change and his attention went not from the mountains but to other things like gals. And that brings up the subject of courting. So I'm going to be telling you about Wiley the man, some of the customs of the times, and some of his tales. And this is one of the customs. Courting, you know what that is, dating. Now in the mountains, it was not too easy to go a-courting because, well, the cabins were so far spread apart. So it was hard to get together with other boys and girls to see who was there and what was going on. And the main times that they could get together would be a social occasion. Like going to church, and but even during the church, the men and the boys had to sit on the right-hand side, and the women and the girls had to sit on the left-hand side. And another way they could get together would be these fall events like molasses pulling. That's when the boys and the girls would be pulling these strings of molasses and making it hard and getting it ready to eat. So there's a lot of fun going on there. And then also in the fall, there were the corn shuckings. Now the corn grew all summer, and then when it was good and ripe, on the stalk they would break off the corn, throw it in the wagon bed and take it back, and dump it out into a great big pile. And the good thing about the Smoky Mountains back in those days was that the communities helped one another out. They did things together. So when it was time for corn shucking, it would become a social event. And people would come from all around to help with the corn shucking. And the young people would come around, and that would give them a chance to get an eyeful of who the other young people were in the community. And one of the little customs was that if you were shucking corn and you happened on a red ear of corn, that meant you got to kiss the gal or the guy that you liked the most. So that gave the youth incentive to shuck that corn even faster than maybe normal. Another thing was this thing of casting sheep eyes. Now, that does not mean that you kill a sheep and gouge his eyes out and chunk him out to the gal you liked. No, it didn't mean nothing like that at all. It meant you sort of looked at the gal that you liked and you sort of looked up sort of shy-like, and that was called casting the sheep eyes. And if the gal liked you back, why, she'd cast the sheep eyes up at you too. But if the gal did not like you, she would cast sour looks at you, mean stares, and the custom said that she kicked you in the leg and broke your leg. But it didn't mean that she actually stomped on him and sent him to the doctor. It just meant that she, I guess, sort of hobbled you, sort of made you limp off like a dog with a hurt leg. And that was called breaking the boy's leg. Well, Wiley did some courting, and I'll tell you a courting tale that he told when he was a teen. He went with two of his friends, 3 teenagers. They had never been courting, they didn't know much about it, but they decided that they would, try it out and see what they could come up with. Well, they knew a farmer who lived probably about an hour away, and he had 3 daughters. So these 3 teens decided that they would go to this family and they would hang around those gals and get as close to them as they could and just see what happened. So Wiley and his 2 buddies, they walked over the mountain until they finally got to this farmhouse. Well, the farmer and his wife and his 3 daughters, they were excited to see somebody coming because the cabins were so far apart that it was just nice to see some fresh faces and to hear some news that they had not heard before. So they welcomed the boys, and not only that, they were not strangers. If they were strangers, they probably might have met them with a shotgun. But since they knew them, and the families knew one another, they decided to invite them up on the porch to set a spell and to visit. So Wiley and his 2 friends, they had a nice visit and getting as close to those gals as they possibly could. Well, dark come on, and they had to, it was a long walk back, so the farmer was gracious enough to invite them to spend the night. Now, that did not mean that the boys would spend the night in the beds of the family members. Back in those days, beds were usually in one, if they had 2 rooms, some of them didn't have 2 rooms, but if they did, one room would be for sleeping, and one room would be for cooking and eating. And the sleeping room, sometimes, Wally said that the beds were so close together, they was maybe 2 feet apart, and you could barely walk between them. But this family had a loft, and that's where the boys could spend the night. So they said goodnight to the family, and the 3 fellas, they went outside, climbed up the pole ladder, and went up into the loft. And then they started undressing for bed, just having their long johns left on. And one of the boys noticed a big crack in the floor there. Now, the floor was made out of these big wide boards that were placed across the joist, and he saw this crack, and he looked down and said, "Oh, look, fellers, they's undressing for bed. Just take a look." So, of course, they all wanted to look down to see what was going on. Well, in the process, the board that feller was on, it evidently wasn't quite long enough to reach from joist to joist too well, or it slipped or something, but it came off the joist and plop, down that feller went right onto one of the beds. And oh, such a racket you never heard. It was like a fox in a hen house down there. But the man, the father, he was very apologetic, saying, "Oh, I am so sorry. Oh my gosh, I hope you didn't hurt yourself, son. the boards was just laid in up there. We ain't got no nails, so I couldn't nail them down, and I apologize. I hope you're all right. Please forgive us. And the boy said it was all right. He was fine. He was a little bit embarrassed, however, because he was in his long johns. And Wally said he was white as a ghost by the time he got back up to the loft again. But he got back up there, and interestingly enough, the three fellers never did tell that family exactly what had been going on that night up in the loft. But I can tell you what was going on. They dropped by, do a little courting. Then they did a little eavesdropping on those gals down there. And then they did a little dropping down to the floor. And that's a little story that Wiley calls a courting tale when he was a teenager. Well, Wiley kept on courting, and he finally met a gal that they decided to get married. Her name was Rebecca Ann Ogle. Now, Rebecca Ann Ogle was the daughter of Noah Bud Ogle. Have any of you ever been on the, I think they call it the Nature Historic Trail? If you're in Gatlinburg, you go up Airport Road, past Minot Park, then it becomes the park proper. And the first cabin on the right is the Bud Ogle cabin. It's a beautiful little cabin. It's made in two parts with a chimney in the middle and this fine barn in the background. Well, Rebecca lived there. She was one of his children. And Wiley and her, I guess they sparked it off and decided to get married. Rebecca was born on Christmas Day. And she was 15 then. So when she turned 16 in the middle part of January, that's when they was going to get married, January the 19th. And Wiley, he was probably either 19 or 20 years old by that time. And by the standards of the day in the mountains, if you got to be that old, you was considered an old maid or old bachelor, and there wasn't too much hope for you, but there was hope for them, and they decided to get married. So Wiley went to the courthouse and got the official paper. Oh, he was so proud of that paper, he was going to get to marry Rebecca. Well, he went over, he was so excited he had to go over that very night and see her, show her that piece of paper, and they were excited. He said, let's go for a walk. So they went out that night, and it was a pretty Smoky Mountain evening, maybe a little cool, but he said, oh, look at those stars, Rebecca. Look up at that moon. He said, let's don't wait no longer. Let's get hitched tonight. He said, I know a preacher man. He's about an hour away from here, and he'd marry us. So they decided to get married that very same night. So they walked on in the moonlight, just holding hands, swinging hands in the moonlight, and they finally got to that cabin. Well, the cabin was pitch black dark. There were no lanterns, no candles burning. It was just dark in there. And but that didn't stop Wiley. He went up the door and he knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Well, finally, a man's voice hollered out, "Who's there knocking?" Wiley said, "It's Roamin Man of the mountain." "What you want, Wiley?" "I'm wanting to get married." "Well, when do you allow you want to get married, Wiley?" "Oh, I wants to get married tonight." "Tonight? Wiley, it's dark. We done gone to bed. The coals is already dark in the fireplace there. Let's do it another time." Oh, Wiley really wanted to get married. He kept pushing, "Oh, please, we'd love to get married tonight." Well, the man inside thought about it a little bit. And, "Well, Wiley, have you got your paper?" "Oh, yes, sir. Got my paper right here in my pocket." "Well, Wiley, you got the gal with you?" "Oh yes, Rebecca's standing right here. I'm going to hold her hand right now." And Wiley, "You got a dollar bill?" "Yep, got a dollar bill too right here in my wallet." "Well, okay, Wiley. I ain't going to get dressed. I ain't going to come out. I'll stand on this side of the door. And you and Rebecca, you stand on the other side of the door and hold hands. And I'll marry you." So Wiley put those things on the door. The preacher man got them out. And so Wiley and Rebecca were standing there, and they joined their hands. And they had their ceremony right there in the moonlight with the door between them and the preacher man. Later on, Wiley was asked, "Wiley, are you sure that you got married, that it was official? Did you have any witnesses to the event? I mean, if the fellow's around the door, he didn't see you." And Wiley said, "Oh, come to think of it, yeah, I do believe that I saw the preacher man's wife peeping up outside of the window. Yep. Oh, and there was an old hooty owl up in the tree. And that hooty owl was going on. Whoo, whoo, whoo. Whoo, whoo, whoo." Who? Wiley and Rebecca. That's who. And that's a little story called The Invisible Preacher. And it's the fanciful story about how Wiley and Rebecca got married. There is another story, but I'll save that for the actual Wilderness Wildlife Week and tell you that time. But I will tell you that the wedding ring was a dime, a silver dime that Wiley had hollowed out. And that dime is still in the family. And one of his sons, Wiley Oakley, one of his daughters, has that dime to this day. So that's how Wiley got married. And the custom at that time was afterwards to have a get-together, a feast, to kill the old red chicken, have chicken and dumplings and lots of food laid out. And then very often, a new bride and a groom would go to something called a wiener cabin. And that doesn't mean hot dog. That means something to wean the couple off from the main family. And so this wiener cabin is where they stayed for a little while. And then Wiley's brother said, "Wiley, I've got some property over on Scratch Britches Mountain. It's a cabin, and there's like 200-300 acres, and 1 acre's cleared, and you and Rebecca can live there and take care of it." So they decided to go live at Scratch Britches Mountain. And after that time, Wiley always referred to his wife as the golden-haired bride of Scratch Britches Mountain. So they packed up some things that they might need to get started their life at Scratch Britches Mountain. And their daddy, who had some bee gums, he had the honey that they used at home, but he also sold honey to make a little money. So he gave them some honey, and they took that, and they made the trek to Scratch Britches Mountain. Now just think of it. Their nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, and it was a long trek to get there. And it was not a paved road by any means. They had to go through the rhododendron tangles and briars and all such things to get there. They had to go over a timber log to get finally to the cabin. But they finally got there, and that's where Wiley and Rebecca had their honeymoon. And Wiley said of it, yep, they had honey and more honey on their honeymoon. Well, honeymoons don't always last. And one of the most famous Wiley tales is about the cow barn. And I'll just say that one you might hear a little later, too, up in January. Well, the honeymoon ended, but they did get back together. And then the rattlesnakes came, and that's another story. And then they finally moved, well, they went to Painter Branch one time. Panther to us, Painter Branch. They lived at Bullhead some. They lived back at Scratch Britches Mountain, and they moved to Cherokee Orchard also, various places. And when they were living at Cherokee Orchard, Wiley started doing one of his most profitable jobs, and that was being a tour guide. Now, he had the reputation already because he had grown up in the Smoky Mountains, knew them like the back of his hand, and even when they were making plans and thinking about the park, he was consulted on the trails and various aspects of the park. So he had been a part of the development and the decision to make the park. And so lots of people were knowing his name, and they realized what a good guide he was because he knew so much about the Smoky Mountains. In fact, the park gave him a little badge, said, #1 guide, and he was that. So he worked with the Mountain View Hotel in Gatlinburg, and they would book things for him to go, people to go hiking with. And he would walk down from Cherokee Orchard to the hotel and guide the people wherever they wanted to go, and come back at night, and then he'd walk back to Cherokee Orchard. And he lived there for a while. Eventually, Rebecca and Wiley moved to Gatlinburg proper. They moved to the Parkway. Now, if you're coming from Pigeon Forge, on the right-hand side, before you get into the main part of Gatlinburg, there's a beautiful old stone building. Martin's Antiques was there at one time. I'm not sure what's there now. But that's where, just a little past that, is where Wiley and Rebecca had their first home in Gatlinburg, across from a haunted mill, by the way. Well, they set up shop, and they had a sign out front. And that sign has been mentioned many a time since that. And the sign said, "Antiques, made to order." And people would come and buy things from that shop. Rebecca was a good weaver. She wove things and sold those. They had little small miniature rocking chairs and other things that the tourists would be interested in. And so they lived and worked there. The dwelling was actually part home and part shop. And Rebecca, well, she ran the shop, and Wiley, he ran away to the mountains to do some guiding. By the way, let me show you a picture of Wiley and Rebecca. This is them right here. This is at their Scratch Britches home. And the little baby in the picture, that's their first son, Elmer. That's Rebecca, Wiley, and Elmer. I guess he was probably 1 or 2 years old at the most in that picture. They had several other children there also. So Wiley became this guide. In fact, sometimes photographers would come calling and they'd want to take a picture of Wiley, and here's one of those. It's a famous postcard of Wiley standing in the spring rhododendron. And that's a very well-known photo of him. Later on, of course, he got older, and here's a picture of Wiley when he was a little bit old, up in years, standing on the stoop of the Wiley shop downtown in Gatlinburg. So anyway, Wiley started this business of guiding folks. Now, even though most of you, unless you're old like me, if you're young and you never heard tell of Wiley Oakley, there are 2 things that probably anybody who comes to the Smoky Mountains knows about or wants to know about. And that is, of course, the Smoky Mountain Bear and that clear liquid. And I don't mean water from the mountain streams. I mean that thing some people called a white mule. Some of them called it husk whiskey. Some of them called it Mountain Dew. And of course, we all know it as moonshine. So I'm going to tell you a little story now that combines the bears and the moonshine. And if I have time, I'll tell you a little bit more about bears a little bit later on. Well, this was not something that happened to Wiley, but a man told him about it. And Wiley says he thinks it is gospel truth. He did not make it up. It's not a tall tale. But the man was talking to Wiley. He said, you know, you can go out and shoot bears and things like that. And by the way, speaking of shooting bears, you know, things are quite different then than they are now. Back then, it was perfectly okay to hunt animals like the black bear. And they were very good for the families of the Smokies because, well, it provided meat for one thing, provided them with furs that they could use to make things out of, and also to sell, to make a little money. Also gave them a lot of tall tales to tell. So the bears were hunted in Wiley's day. Nowadays, of course, they are protected species, and they are dangerous. They look cute and they may look cuddly, but don't try to take any selfies with a black bear. I don't think it'd be a good idea. But anyway, this man was saying, well, you can get a bear with a gun, but I have found another way. You see, I had this bear, this aggravating bear that kept coming over the fence and getting into my cornfield. Now, this cornfield was on what Wiley called a sharp angle mountain. As you know, there are some high places here in the mountains, and mountain people would have to plant their crops wherever they could. So the cornfield was on this half-angle mountain there. And this bear would come in of a night and steal some of his corn, and the man didn't like it, of course. So he decided to go out and sit at this fence and wait for the bear late at night. And the time went on, and it was later and later. It was awful dark, and he couldn't see nothing, so he finally gave up on that notion. And then he came up with an idea. Got him a bucket, a candy bucket. And this is the kind of bucket that they used to drain maple from the maple trees. And he said, what you do, Wiley, is you get a half a gallon of moonshine, and you get a half a gallon of honey. And you know bears like that honey. And you just stir it up real good. And what I done, Wiley, I put that bucket of moonshine and honey right by the fence there, and left it there, and went on back to the cabin. That was Saturday night. Sunday morning, the man got up, and he went out to see what had happened. Well, when he got there, the candy bucket was tipped over on its side. And he picked it up and looked, and it was licked, slick, clean. There wasn't a drop of honey or moonshine left in that bucket. And then he noticed behind him his corn patch. There was a wide path going down the hillside in that corn patch. The corn stalks all mashed down. So he walked down the hillside to see what was going on, what happened down there. And when he went down there, and there was that bear. That bear had drunk all of that moonshine and honey, and he was just there, just drunk as a fool, the man said. Well, I won't tell you what happened to that bear, but you can probably use your imagination. What I will tell you is that that bear stuck its nose where it shouldn't have had. It oughtn't have stuck its nose, and then took a nose dive down the mountain, being a little drunk. And I guess the moral of that story, if there are any bears watching out there, the moral would be, don't drink and dive. But I will close by saying that that bear met his end with a great big old grin on his face. That's the story about moonshine and bears in the Smokies. Now let's get back to that guiding business. There's a story I'd like to tell that's in Wiley's book. He wrote a book called Roamin' and Restin'. And it's a collection of tales, things that had happened to him, people he had met. And it was published in 1986 by the local press. And it was written by Wiley in his inimitable style. He had no education, so he didn't know how to spell things real good. And so he just sounded them out, and however they sounded to him, that's how he wrote them down. But it's a delightful book. Well, in this book, there's a story called Uncle Tom Campbell. Cammel. I didn't quite know what that referred to at the time, and then later I realized, oh my gosh, that's Wiley's spelling of Campbell. Campbell. And sure enough, Uncle Tom was the man who lived up on the mountain on the outskirts of Gatlinburg and going toward the park. And the road that leads up there now, there was no road then, just a trail. The road is called Campbell Lead. The only way to get up there was this really tough trail of about a mile that went almost straight up the mountain. So it was a difficult hike. but it was well worth it because on top of that mountain, there lived Uncle Tom Campbell and his wife, Aunt Sophie. Wiley said that they were some of the most interesting people in the Smoky Mountains. Just as nice as could be, as honest as the day was long. They never took advantage of nobody at all. And so he loved to take people up there. And they loved to see visitors come because it was a breath of fresh air to have some new folks come up and visit them. So it was a favorite place for Wiley to go. Uncle Tom was a fox hunter. And Wiley said that just anytime he went up there, if he wanted to go fox hunting, why, old Mr. Uncle Tom, he would be ready to go fox hunting. And Aunt Sophie, let me show you a picture of Aunt Sophie. She was a delightful character. There's a picture of Aunt Sophie. And she was known for making and smoking these long stem pipes. She made them herself. She got the clay from down in Gatlinburg. She got cane to make the stems out of. She'd form the pipes in these molds that her husband carved out of wood and bake them in the fireplace ashes, stick the stem in it, and then she would sell them to tourists. And she became quite well known for them. And it was said of Aunt Sophie, if you was to meet her in the curve of the trail, you would probably see her pipe before you would see Aunt Sophie. So this was where Wiley liked to go and take some of his tourists up. Well, one time he took this group of women, 100 of them, all teachers. And they were hiking up this trail, and these educated women were not quite used to the circumstances of walking up a steep mountain trail like that. And they were complaining, oh my gosh, this is hard. Are we there yet? Oh my gosh, I'm tired. They were just complaining all the way and asking, Wiley, are you sure this is the best way to get up to this Campbell home? And Wiley said, oh yes. But they kept on complaining. And I guess Wiley was happy when they finally got to the top of that mountain for the little visit. And they had a nice visit. Behind the home of the Campbells, there was a beautiful vista, a great view. And so they watched the view and they talked to one another and sat around on the porch and had a good visit. And during that time, one of the women, one of the teachers, went to her, to the woman, and said, Aunt Sophie, now, is there not another way to get up to your cabin? And she said, well, yeah, there is, but it's a bad trail. The way that Wiley brought you, that is the best way to come. And Wiley, of course, felt better because he had been vindicated, that he had taken him up the wrong way and he wasn't trying to do him any kind of harm or anything. Well, they had a nice visit and then they went on down the mountain. And the women were still down with complaining, all the way down. And I imagine Wiley was a little bit tired of that group by the time he got back and glad to get rid of them. So he went on back to the Wiley shop. And he was a little bit hungry. So he scrounged around the kitchen and saw a nice big onion there. I don't know whether he made an onion sandwich or whether he just took the onion up and took a great big old bite up and started eating that onion. Well, it was not too long at all before his wife, Rebecca, came running in that room. Wiley, you get out of here right now. Oh, Lord, Wiley, get out of here, get outside, go. So Wiley had to go outside. By that time, there were sidewalks in Gatlinburg, and they had these little cement benches along the way. And there was one outside the Wiley shop, so he went out and sat on that cement bench, just enjoying the night air. And a woman came by. I think it was one of the women, one of those teachers from that trip that day. And she saw Wiley, so she stopped by, and first thing she said was, Wiley, don't deny, you have eaten onions. He said, yes, I have, and I've been run out the shop because my wife come in, and my daughter was Cindy too. They come in and said, Wiley, your breath is too loud. You got to get out of here. You're going to run the tourists out of the shop. Going outside, Wiley. So I came out here, get a little peace and quiet. So they sat there and they talked a little bit more. Got quiet, and the woman said, Wiley, why do you think it is that Uncle Tom lives way on top of that high mountain, so hard to get to, away from everybody? And Wiley thought about it. He said, well, I reckon Uncle Tom lives up there away from everybody on that high mountain so he can eat onion and not bother nobody. And that's a story called Uncle Tom Campbell in the book Roamin' and Restin' by Wiley Oakley. So that's one of his little hiking adventures, and there were many others. I don't know how much my time is, but there's one about the Bolton taters, which is a good one. I might save that one for another time. But I'll go back to some bears right now, because everybody likes to hear about the bears. A lot of people would ask Wiley, well, what do you do if you was to meet a bear on the trail? And Wiley's advice was always the same. He said, stop, be still, don't move, don't say nothing. And if that bear don't move, then you move. But if it's a mama bear with her cubs, you might as well just give her the room, because she ain't gonna budge for you, and she's gonna try to run you off. Another tale about bears, a little short bit. Wiley also guided people, and they would often go to the Chimneys picnic grounds. And that's going up toward Newfound Gap, past Sugarlands, on the right-hand side. And very often they would have lunch and do things there. And two little bits. He tells about this male bear who wasn't too smart. Wiley said, I saw that bear going into the ladies' restroom. I guess he couldn't read. And then there's a little bit of a sad story, too, that he tells about 4.5 bears. 4.5 bears. Well, it was in the picnic grounds again, and there was this garbage can. There's 3 bears standing around, and one bear took a nosedive in it, and just his behind his legs was sticking up. So Wiley called that 4.5 bears. And I said that I might tell you a little jack tale, and I don't want to take too much time, so I won't tell you one of the long jack tales. Now, what are jack tales? Jack tales, well, you can find them in a book that I wrote called Smoky Mountain Jack Tales of Winter and Old Christmas. And it's Christmas stories, and then there's 12 stories of other times also. And in that book, there's a couple stories about bears in that one. But I'll just tell you a little short thing. And it's more of a throwaway, kind of a joke, I guess you might say. The jack tales are tall tales, are folk tales. They involve Jack, you know, the fellow that climbed that bean tree. That's a long story. And the one about the flying ship, that's a long story. And the one about the witches called Sock Doll, that's one of the long tales. This is just a little short bit. Jack was in the mountains, and Jack happened to run on this bear. And for some reason, that bear did not like Jack. Didn't like his smell, didn't like his look, didn't like nothing about him, and started to chase Jack down the mountain. So Jack took off and running, whippity-cut down the mountain. Well, he was running, he finally got to the edge of Gatlinburg there, and the law saw him. And the law stopped and said, Jack, you stop right there. You can't come into town like this. It's indecent. Jack, I will have to put you in jail if you come to this town with a bear behind. And that's a little funny. Called a jack tale. And those are some stories from Wiley Oakley, Roamin Man of the Smoky Mountains. And Wiley roamed all of his life, but now he's resting up in a cemetery, in the White Oak Flats Cemetery. And he died in November of 1954. His wife lived many years. They had 12 children, not all at once, but they had 12. Two of them died early on, but the rest of them lived to be very old folks, and there's still a lot of that kin around. I'll close with a quote, 4 lines from a song that a man named Malcolm Lent wrote. And the song goes something like this. Wiley Oakley was a mountain man. He told tall tales about his life, and he lives in story, he lives in song, and he lives in the mountains till the mountains are gone. And that's Wiley Oakley. I hope you come by and hear some more about Wiley on Friday, and I believe it's January the 27th or 8th, I've forgotten which, at noon. And so stop by and you'll hear some more about Jack and maybe a longer Jack tale. Thank you. Come on out to Wilderness Wildlife Week. Thank you.